listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions, the fortnightly podcast that brings you dark tales, both old and new, performed by voice artist Kristin Holland. You know, one of the exciting perks, as it were, of producing this podcast is having the opportunity to read all the wonderful stories that are submitted to us to be considered for inclusion on the show. And when that story comes from the twisted mind of one of our dedicated listeners, well, I must admit, it warms the cockles of our, what's her name? Now, of course, not all of the stories we receive end up making it past our humble narrator's selection process, which could probably best be described as capricious, but we are truly grateful for all the deliciously dark scribblings that you share with us. Thank you, dear acolytes. Thank you. Now, as you've probably guessed from this little preamble, it is our intention this episode to share another masterpiece from one of the Nocturnal Transmissions faithful with the world. Boy, oh boy, when we read this one, well, let's just say it was impossible to resist. I believe you'll understand why when you hear it, gentle listener. This devious author's heady combination of outright flattery and sly negging were just the right manner of flypaper with which to, our humble narrator, entrap. Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present R.T. Raynaud's Mirror, Mirror. Frank got into his car to drive to work. It was 7:22 a.m. He was still groggy and drinking coffee out of his travel mug as he pulled out of his driveway. A notification on his phone came up that a new episode had been posted on his favorite podcast. The new episode was entitled Mirror, Mirror and was an hour and 15 minutes in length. Oh, perfect, Frank thought. This episode should last me most of my drive to work. Frank mounted his phone to his dashboard, pressed play, and the episode began. Frank was relatively new to podcasts. Previously, whenever driving, he stayed to the radio, listening to all his favorite songs on the internet radio station he had found. Frank still remembered when the only music available to him while driving came from his hometown's one radio station. Learning how to play any song on demand while driving had been a revelation. But ever since he moved out of the city and lengthened his commute, Frank started thinking that the 3 hours he spent in his car each day, an hour and a half each way, could be better served listening to something with a little more substance than the same exact music he'd been listening to since high school. To fill this void, Frank started listening to scary story podcasts. Growing up, Frank had always loved listening to ghost stories. A good scary story held his attention and gave him goosebumps. When he discovered this genre on his podcast provider, it seemed like a natural fit for him. Most of the podcasts he had first encountered were a bit boring. However, there was one podcast in particular he preferred, though the name of the podcast, Nocturnal Transmissions, was a tad sophomoric for his tastes. The first episode he found was a reading of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. Being a lover of classical literature, a Poe reading seemed like a natural bridge into this particular podcast genre for Frank. he queued up the episode. It started with a macabrely humorous introduction by a very Crypt Keeper-esque story-within-a-story narrator discussing Poe's life and death before starting the actual story. 20 minutes later, as the story ended, Frank had pulled over and his heart was racing. He stared at his phone in disbelief. He had never been so affected by the telling of a story. He skipped back a few minutes to relive the climax again.
But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark! Louder, 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 louder! Villains, I shrieked! Dissemble no more! I admit the deed! Tear up the planks! Here! Here! It is the beating of his hideous heart!
Frank was out of breath again. While Frank had been a fan of Poe, he had always considered The Telltale Heart to be one of Poe's lesser stories. But a scary story is only as scary as the storyteller, and it was the reading that gripped Frank. As the tale ended, the story-within-a-story narrator began to wrap up the episode.
The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. Well, that was fun.
That was fun, Frank thought. By pulling over and listening to the end of the story again, Frank realized that the story had now made him late for work. If the other episodes were like this, there was going to be no risk of this one getting boring. He hit subscribe. Over the next couple of weeks, Frank burned through the other episodes of the podcast. Some stories interested Frank more than others, but all were entertaining. The only problem with the podcast seemed to be that Frank couldn't get enough of it. Episodes only came out once every 2 weeks. Considering the production that would go into a single episode, and that everything seemed to be done by only one guy, the length of time between episodes was not a surprise. But it meant that Frank had to wait for 2 weeks to get the latest animated scary story. Frank was eagerly looking forward to this new episode while he drove. He was pulling onto the highway on-ramp and merging into traffic as the story-within-a-story narrator began speaking.
Hello, gentle listener, and welcome to Nocturnal Transmissions, the fortnightly podcast that brings you dark tales, both old and new, performed by voice artist Kristin Holland. On this episode, we will be considering the concept of mimesis, much opined upon by Aristotle and his fellow philosophers. To put it in a nutshell, mimesis refers to art as the imitation of nature or life. Art imitates life. We've all heard that phrase before, haven't we, gentle listeners? And who would argue with this simple truism? Well, the answer is Oscar Wilde, that great turner of turns of phrase, who rather contrarily observed that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. Did you know that there was a real person named Walter White convicted of selling methamphetamines a la TV's Breaking Bad? Or that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of the written world's greatest sleuth, Sherlock Holmes, actually used his own powers of deduction to intervene in a case, saving a wrongly convicted man from death? Sometimes the manner in which life imitates art is decidedly creepy. Take Edgar Allan Poe's tale, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, in which survivors of a whaler sunk by a storm cannibalize a cabin boy named Richard Parker. Little did Poe know that almost 50 years later, a real-life incident would occur in which, to survive at sea, the crew of a storm-sunken vessel likewise cannibalized their cabin boy. His name? Richard Parker. And I couldn't possibly leave this topic without mentioning Morgan Robertson's 1898 novella, Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan, in which he describes a large ocean liner named the Titan, which sinks after hitting an iceberg. The similarities between Robertson's work to the sinking of the actual Titanic in 1912 are both numerous and spooky. Robertson played coy when asked about these uncanny parallels, claiming his story was based simply on his understanding of ships and ocean travel. However, the unsettling similarities have caused more than one person to accuse Robertson of clairvoyance. In this vein, tonight's tale is a mind-bending foray into the interplay between life and art, as they imitate, predict, inspire, and perhaps cause one another. Nocturnal Transmissions is proud to present R.T. Raynaud's Mirror, Mirror.
The host stopped, and the voice actor started to tell the story in a less dramatic voice.
Frank got into his car to drive to work. It was 7:22 a.m. He was still groggy and drinking coffee out of his travel mug as he pulled out of his driveway. A notification on his phone came up that a new episode had been posted on his favorite podcast. The new episode was entitled Mirror, Mirror, and was an hour and 15 minutes in length. Oh, perfect, Frank thought. This episode should last me most of my drive to work. Frank mounted his phone to his dashboard, pressed play, and the episode began.
As Frank drove, he recognized that the character in the story was named Frank, leading Frank to think stupidly, "Hey, that's my name," and experience a brief twinge of pride for having such a popular name. Frank continued to listen to the episode as he put on his turn signal and changed lanes on the highway.
Frank pulled onto the highway on-ramp and then merged into traffic while listening to the episode's introduction. Once the story started, Frank experienced a sense of self-satisfaction as he realized that the character in the episode had the same name as he did. Frank continued to drive on the highway for several minutes before changing lanes.
Frank sipped his coffee, listening to the episode. Something felt off, though he could not quite put his finger on it. The story was being told in a choppy manner. As Frank listened, however, a truck passed him on the right, cut into his lane and jammed on its brakes. Frank had to jam on his brakes too to avoid rear-ending the truck. "What the hell are you doing?" Frank yelled. Frank's adrenaline shot up. All the while, the story pressed on.
Frank sipped his coffee to continue the process of waking up. The reading of the story seemed strange to Frank, different from how stories are usually told on this podcast. A truck sped past Frank and then cut him off, causing Frank to jam on his brakes and curse at the driver. The adrenaline woke Frank up in a way that the coffee could not.
It slowly dawned on Frank that the podcast seemed to be mirroring what was happening to him. Frank stared at his phone in disbelief. Is the podcast narrating my commute? Frank thought. Not only narrating, but doing so in real time as events occurred. The story continued.
Considering how the episode had been progressing, Frank started to suspect that the podcast was narrating his commute.
Frank rejected the idea out of hand. How the hell would this pre-recorded podcast know what I'm doing in real time? Frank thought. Is this some kind of prank? Frank frantically looked around the car, checking to see if he could spot a hidden camera or microphone sticking out. Frank likely would not have been able to identify anything even if he had seen something, but his impulses compelled him to check nonetheless. Frank gave up when he realized that not only was the podcast stating his actions, it also seemed to know what he was thinking. The story continued.
Frank thought that the idea of the podcast narrating his commute was preposterous. His first inclination was that someone was playing a trick on him. He looked around paranoidly, but in vain. Eventually, he came to the realization that even were someone playing a trick on him by simultaneously observing his actions and having them broadcast by the narrator in real time over his phone, nobody would have been able to narrate his thoughts.
Frank thought that he might be able to trick whatever was doing this. He was driving down the center lane of the highway. He put on his left turn signal and, making sure that he was clear, veered into the right lane. Frank hoped that the podcast would misreport what Frank had been doing. The story continued.
Hoping to trip up whatever was messing with him, Frank put on his left turn signal, but veered into the right lane instead. Frank's ruse obviously did not work, as the story kept right on narrating.
And the story did just keep right on narrating, Frank driving down the roadway. Whatever slight move or purposeful thought Frank made while he was driving was called out from the podcast. Frank turned the podcast off and then back on. When it came back, the podcast continued narrating what Frank was doing. Frank turned the podcast off for even longer and then turned it back on. When it came back, not only did the podcast again continue narrating what Frank was doing, Frank also noticed that the episode had advanced, as if it had continued playing the entire time. Frank then tried to advance the episode to the end. His phone showed that the podcast was loading. After 5 minutes of the loading screen, Frank gave up. Of course it's not going to let me fast forward to see what's coming, Frank thought. Frank returned the episode to where it should have been if he had played it from the beginning. When it started playing again, the podcast summarized Frank's recent efforts and continued narrating. Then it hit him. What was at the end of this episode? While he hadn't spent too much time thinking about it before now, he had just kind of assumed that he would arrive at work when his commute was over. But it usually took him an hour and a half to get to work from his house. The episode was only an hour and 15 minutes long. The episode was going to end at 8:37 a.m. Around 15 minutes before he usually got to work. Did that mean anything? Would the episode just end? Frank was convinced that this was too crazy and significant an occurrence for the episode to just end. What sense would that make? A paranoid thought then came over Frank. What if the episode ends there because because there is nothing left to narrate. Clearly, this episode is centered around Frank. What if the episode ends because he ends? Frank paused in contemplation as he drew out the next reasonable conclusion. Is this podcast telling me when I'm going to die? Frank thought. Frank looked at the time left on the podcast. 24 minutes and 4 seconds. Much to Frank's dismay, the podcast continued.
The realization that the episode would be ending 15 minutes before he was supposed to get to work fell hard on Frank. Frank was convinced that this episode was not going to end randomly. No, Frank thought that there must be a deeper significance to the length of the episode. To Frank, the one glaring and obvious conclusion from this was that the episode was going to end with his death. The more Frank thought about it, the more convinced of it he became.
It was unsettling to Frank for the podcast to tell him that he was becoming more and more convinced that he was going to die in now 22 minutes and 18 seconds. Part of him was still skeptical of everything that was happening this morning, that this was all somehow a supremely elaborate hoax. But as he heard the podcast say the words, the episode was going to end with his death, they became inexorable. Frank paused the podcast. Frank's pulse quickened, and he began to sweat. What should I do? Frank thought. He put on his blinker, intending to pull over, but he hesitated. What if me pulling over is what leads to my death? Frank switched off his blinker and continued driving. Then the logical next question flashed into Frank's mind. What if me continuing to drive is what leads to my death? Frank became confused and scared. For the next 10 miles, Frank drove as if on autopilot, his brain not really registering what he was doing, but rather was fixating on what to do next. Frank saw the exit for a rest area. Figuring that not driving is probably safer than driving, Frank took the exit and stopped his car in the rest area while he took a breath to figure the situation out. Frank stared at his phone. It was 8:29 a.m. The episode was supposed to end in a couple of minutes. Frank wanted to know what was going on with the podcast, but still feared that the situation hadn't changed. After a few beats, he grabbed his phone and pressed play. The narrator came on.
Julia was getting more and more agitated by the fact that the podcast was narrating her driving. She turned down Elm. Julia's phone received a text message. Julia grabbed her phone and opened the text message. "What are you doing tonight?" Julia sighed and shook her head. Her ex-boyfriend was the very last person she wanted to spend time with.
Frank was confused. Who the hell is Julia? He thought. Then it hit him. He was no longer the subject of the podcast. The podcast had moved on to somebody else. He had been so afraid. Now that the podcast was focused on somebody else, Frank started to feel relief. Maybe whatever this was did just end randomly, he thought. He sighed and chuckled. He started his car and drove out of the rest area, merging back onto the highway. The story continued.
Julia continued driving. Portia yelled from the back seat about how her Cheerios had fallen onto the floor. Julia looked back at Portia and then to the floor and saw the bag of Cheerios on the floorboard with loose Cheerios scattered about. Portia was becoming inconsolable and was straining in the car seat. Julia told Portia that it was all right and that she should settle down. Portia responded by screaming louder. The podcast narrated everything.
Frank continued to wonder in amusement about the situation as he drove. "What the fuck was all that about then?" Frank asked aloud. "Who is this?" Pulling into the rest area had only delayed him a couple of minutes. He would still make it to work on time. Frank came to his exit and pulled off. He came to the stop sign at the bottom of the exit ramp, took a left, and started travelling towards his job. As he came to a stoplight, the story continued.
Julia's agitation increased. She tried to shush Portia as gently as she could and told Portia that she would just have to wait for her Cheerios since they were running late. Portia was not pleased with her mother's response and cried even louder. Julia reached back to where she last saw the spilled bag of Cheerios and began to feel around. Julia's eyes were darting quickly back and forth between the road and the back seat to see where she was reaching. In her distraction, Julia did not see that the stoplight in front of her had changed from yellow to red, and that Frank's car was entering the intersection.
"Frank's car!" Frank thought. He quickly realized that his stoplight had just turned green, and he was now currently driving through the middle of an intersection. The cross street? Elm. He looked to his left. A large SUV was barreling at him. The driver, a woman in her mid-30s, had been looking into the back seat and quickly whipped her head forward. Frank and the woman locked eyes. The SUV did not appear to be stopping. Indeed, it appeared to be too late for her to stop at all. Frank read panic on the woman's face. The SUV slammed into the side of Frank's car, caving in Frank's entire driver's side. The concussion from the impact popped Frank's eardrums and caused his vision to white out before going completely dark. When Frank's senses returned moments later, he could see that he was now located where his gearbox had been moments before, his body now intertwined with a jumble of bloody metal, glass and plastic. Blood was draining into his eyes. Everything felt like he was underwater. He didn't feel any pain, but he suspected that was just because it hadn't caught up with him yet. Frank looked towards the SUV. The woman's head had burst through the windshield and she lay motionless, black blood and hair dripping down into the now exposed engine cavity. Frank could hear the horn from the SUV blaring, though the noise was faint because of his ear injuries. He could see bystanders running towards him from the sidewalk. The impact had initially made Frank's body feel hot, a mixture of flowing blood and adrenaline, but Frank started to notice that he was getting colder, much colder. Frank's phone had not been dislodged by the impact. He could no longer hear the podcast, but he could see the podcast episode still playing. It was reaching the end. His vision started to blur and darken. The last thing he noticed before he slipped away into the black was the illuminated clock on the dash. It read
8:37 a.m.